First reading this morning is taken from 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 through 21. Now, the boy, Samuel, was ministering to the Lord under Eli. And this next line, I think, is really interesting because every time I read, and I've read this story many, many times, but I never noticed this line before. And it says here, so that Samuel's ministering to the Lord under Eli, and it says, the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. I think that's interesting to hear because I think we tend to think about that this is the only time when the word of the Lord is rare and visions are not widespread. But this is something that's happened throughout the history of salvation, so we're not alone in sometimes being out there and feeling like there isn't a voice of prophecy. And at that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, Samuel, Samuel, and he said, Here I am. And he ran to Eli and said, Here I am, you called me. But Eli said, I didn't call, lie down again. So he went and lay down. The Lord called again, Samuel, Samuel. Samuel got up and he went to Eli and said, Here I am, you called me. And Eli said, I did not call you, my son. Lie down again. I think Eli was getting a little fed up with this. And Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. And the Lord called Samuel again, a third time. And he got up and went to Eli and said, Here I am, you did call me. And Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, Go, lie down. And if he calls you, say, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there as before, calling, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening. Then the Lord said to Samuel, See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears it tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end, for I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever. Samuel lay there until morning. Now I think it might have been a kind of a sleepless night for our young man Samuel. He has just gotten some very difficult news from God. And he was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli called Samuel and he said to him, Samuel, my son. And he said, Here I am. That's that phrase we hear over and over in these passages. Hineni in Hebrew. Here I am, here I am. And Samuel says, Here I am. And Eli said, What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he told you. Now Eli has laid a heavy burden on Samuel. He's really cursed him now. If you don't tell me the truth, you're getting whatever I'm getting. So Samuel told him everything, hid nothing from him. And then Eli said, It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good. Let him do what seems good to him. Now Samuel grew up. The Lord was with him, and he let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. And this ends the reading. Well, now, phone calls. I find that phone calls that we get at night are generally not a good thing. Now, most of us are not woken up by the Nobel Prize Committee or by Publishers Clearinghouse. You know, as a matter of fact, I don't really like to answer the phone at all. I'm a little phone phobic. The phone rings, and I tend to glance over at it and think, what now? You know, there's a scene in a 1965 movie, 1,000 Clowns, where the character named Murray was played by Jason Robards. It's a very funny movie, I think. And this Murray in the movie, the phone will ring, and Murray will say, "Hello? Is this someone with good news or money? No? Goodbye." Well, you know, when I was a teenager when I first saw 1,000 Clowns, and I can tell you that that phone bit did not go over that well at home. But now it's very different, isn't it? Now we live in this world of robocalls and phone scam artists who call us at all the times of the day and try to take advantage of us. And for the most part, they don't know our names, do they? Actually, sometimes it takes me 30 seconds or so before I even realize that I'm talking to a recording. I hate that. And then there's the one, do you ever get the call? It must be a call center somewhere in India, and they say that they're calling from Microsoft about a problem with my computer, and they want me to give them my credit card number so that they can sell me a piece of software that will solve this problem. Now, I get this call many times a week, and I have taken to doing something. Well, it might be a little mean, but I'm sorry, it works. When I get this call and they say their spiel, I say, "Does your mother know what you do for a living?" I'm sorry, I'm trying to instill a little shame and guilt in the scam artists of the world. And they say, "What? Does your mother know what you for?" Click. They haven't stopped calling, though. Now, but calls in the middle of the night are the worst. We know that. I think perhaps the older we get, the more we feel that. They can strike us with a sense of dread. And now, if you're a minister or the spouse of one, over the course of years, this will happen. Occasionally, this call, you'll find that the news is a relief when you hear that someone, perhaps who was sick for a long time, has finally moved on from this world, which had become so difficult for them. But sometimes it's the news that a teenager had been in a tragic accident and is clinging to life in the emergency room. There really isn't much you can do, but you go, and you sometimes sit with a family in a harshly lit waiting room for a long time and receive with them what might be the worst news of their life. And you try to bring the love of God and the church to them. It's hard because we're all sitting there, and I think to some degree we might not be saying it, but we're all sitting there and we're thinking somewhere, "God, what were you thinking? What were you thinking?" Sometimes God calls in the middle of the night, or sometimes it's an isolated place. Sometimes it's from even the darkness of a prison cell. Sometimes it's just a suburban bedroom. But when God calls, God, unlike the call center in Mumbai, God knows our name. I can't explain that. The folks who come to the Bible study on Wednesday may be surprised to hear me say that, but I believe it. I believe in every fiber of my body that God knows everyone's name. Now, God doesn't always seem to have good news or money for us. I think we could just hang up. It probably wouldn't be much help, though. Not with God. Did you ever watch the television comedy, The Big Bang Theory? Anybody know Big Bang? Well, I think God sometimes behaves like Sheldon, Penny, Samuel. We may resist, but God and Sheldon persist. You got to answer the door eventually. You have to pick up the phone. You have to do whatever it is to open that line of communication. I wish I could say that it was always good news, even when God calls, and it may be that we don't have the historical perspective to see the big picture. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense. Sometimes it breaks our hearts. I think that if you live long enough, something will break your heart. I wish I could say that this is an isolated and rare phenomenon in the history of salvation, but it's not. It's not. Let's reflect on this story of ours for a while. Things went terribly wrong in the garden. You remember that? It was a long, hard story. Moses gets called to a life of frustration. It never ends well for the prophets. Even this story today about Samuel, which, when we tell it and think about it, we tend to romanticize it, in our minds, because it's sort of a kind of compelling, this God calling over and over. But Samuel answers, and when he does, his first duty is to tell his mentor that God has eternally cursed him and his family. Skip ahead in the book. A girl named Mary gets called. She faces shame, culminates in grief, and even Jesus, we know what happened to him. What was God thinking? What was God thinking? Eli, the priest in the story, tells us. He says, of course, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." Well, I find that not 100% consoling. And I have to say that when I got to about this point in my sermon last night, and my wife, Patricia, who was having a very difficult time getting up and moving because of her total knee replacement, so she's a captive audience, I said, I'm a little afraid about this sermon. It seems like it's kind of a downer. Kind of a downer, Fred. Well, I wish I could tell you that it's going to be all rainbows and unicorns. I wish I could tell you that it's all about prosperity. I wish I could close the book and say they all lived happily ever after. But that simply is not this world. We live in this world. We have to muck it through in this messy world. And the only reason that we get to live in this world and get to continue on is because I believe we live in the driving energy of God's love, even in the face of all that I've said. We live in the face of misery and death, and we shout hope into its ugly, gaping maw. It's love Yeah, it's love. It's not Hallmark card love, but love that was won on the cross and continues to be so today. Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov spelled it out. He said, "Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams." We live in a world, if we're Christian, we're living not in a world of dreams, but in a world of action. We see the horror on the news, the carnage, the fires, and we will be ridiculed, but we are called to be there in the midst of the world, using our hands and our hearts, and we shout hope into the world. We are the voice, the only voice that can call the world by its name. And while this is a difficult road, we don't walk it. We don't walk it by ourselves. What is that song? Why should I feel discouraged? Why should the shadows come, and why should my heart be lonely and long for heaven and home when Jesus is my portion, my constant friend is He? Oh, His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watched over me. You know, and I wanted to leave these next lines out of the song because it seemed to me like, well, you know, this doesn't quite fit in with what you've been saying today. But the song, you know, goes on and says, I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. His eye is on the sparrow. And I know. I know He watches over me. Amen.